In this video, I'm going to show you how to take a dull, boring, pretty lifeless game like this one and transform it into a fun and exciting game that will most importantly feel good to play. You can use any of these hacks to immediately juice up your indie game with relatively little effort. So if you like any of these ideas, please consider subscribing to my channel, and without any further ado, let's just get started. So we have this basic shooting game. You control this cannon in the middle of the screen and enemies fly in from the edge of the screen towards the center. The cannon points at the mouse and if you click, it shoots. It's a good start to a project, and I'm sure many of you have made something somewhat similar if you've just started a new project or you're new to game dev itself. While it's a solid start, it feels quite flat and boring. You're going to want to spice it up a bit, but you're not sure how to, which brings me to my first hack. Number one is purpose, and you're going to have to make sure that your game has a solid, defined purpose. Without any goals or objectives, there's a strong chance your players aren't going to have a reason to want to play your game. There are slight exceptions to this with games like Minecraft, but even in Minecraft, the game has been designed in such a way that players can set their own goals within the game's rules and boundaries. For our example game, I've simply added a high score counter on the cannon. You gain points for beating enemies, and your score is divided by 10 if an enemy reaches the cannon. This challenges people to reach as high a score as possible without losing all their score through damage. Whilst I think a high score works fine in this particular scenario, and it's pretty easy to implement for an arcade game like this, you might want to consider what other goals you're setting for your players within your game. For example, are you motivating them to keep playing through your game's story, or are you challenging them to complete a given set of objectives? The possibilities are endless, and it's up to you to guide how the player sees their goals when playing your game. My second tip is to try and spice your art up, even if it's just a little bit. This one can be tricky, but even making some small changes to flat colored shapes, or even saving some preset assets for usage in situations like this, can make all of the difference. The first impressions of your game always matter so much and will vastly affect someone's opinion of them. And I have found that just putting a little bit of extra effort at the programmer art stage helps people understand what you're trying to do a lot better. So even just finding one little trick you can apply to your programmer art that helps it along a bit will actually make a huge difference in terms of other people's perception of your game. As an example, I gave all of the shapes borders just to make them a little bit more interesting, as well as giving the enemies a little angry face. Visual cues like this help players to understand your game a lot faster, meaning that they can start having fun a lot sooner. However, I do understand that art can be difficult for some people, so I've made sure these next steps will work regardless of your artistic ability. Particles, you know them? You love them. Particle effects are one of the most important things to consider when game objects in your world are interacting, but they must be used with actual purpose in mind. They are often used by game developers as one of the only things to signal that two things have interacted or something has happened within your game world. And I also think they are vital for when things are destroyed in your game world. In the real world, when something is destroyed or stops working or loses, it isn't just spontaneously removed from existence. So in a game, we need to provide some indication that something has changed, whether that is through particle effects appearing when something's destroyed, or even just a simple animation to show that it's going to disappear. Signaling information like this to players over a bit of time instead of just having it happen suddenly is so important to making sure your game feels right. I usually like to add some particle effects for most interactions or movements in my game, even if they're pretty minimal. You should be able to see that there are movement trails behind the enemies and the bullets, big particle explosions when bullets or enemies are destroyed, and a tiny number of particles leave the cannon barrel when it's fired. Despite using the same particle sprite, they each have their own physics to match the situation that they're used in. I think it's far too easy to just aimlessly pile particles into a game without considering what you want them to look like, and so what information you want them to give to your players. Really thinking about this will help you use particles to their maximum effectiveness. Shaders are like an ancient magic that can make everything in your game better in an instant. From the simplest contrast and colour balancing shaders to bloom effects like the one I've added in here, to full-on distortions of the screen. A shader can make a world of difference to the look of your game without you having to adjust any of your game art at all. Something important with shaders though is that some players can find them very distracting, especially as some of the full screen shaders can be quite obtrusive. So it's worth considering adding an option in your game, especially for larger scale projects, that allows your player to disable them. I know that in both Unity and GameMaker, you can easily add a full screen shader to your game with only a small amount of research and effort. Our fifth thing to add would be Screenshake, and I know it's pretty common knowledge at this point to have this as a part of your action games. But adding the right amount of Screenshake in the right places for the big impacts in your game can add so much to the game's feel that I still feel like I have to include it in a list like this. However, like with shaders, some players just don't like Screenshake and prefer not to have it, so you should absolutely make it optional for players if you're able to. And even Earthquake fanboys like myself can't see it done constantly. Using Screenshake sparingly is what's going to make it its most effective. I also added a bit of kickback on the cannon each time it fires, which makes it feel more realistic. I'd like to see anyone fire a cannon with 0 knockback in real life, and until I see it done, I'm going to keep adding kickback to my weapons in games. Alright, when you watch something happen in the real world, you don't just see it happen. You hear, feel, and sometimes even smell or taste it happen too. Unfortunately, due to the limitations of smell-o-vision, it seems like we're going to be a bit of a way off that. And taste is, well, apart from Cooking Mama, there are very few games I'd want to actually taste. But you can make the most of sound, and you absolutely should. And I personally think having carefully thought about sound effects makes a huge difference to a game, especially the feel of the game. For our little example, we're just going to add some tiny arcade noises generated using BFXR, but you can make sound in a whole host of different ways, you just need to get creative. And I already think it's sounding much better. Remember, I changed no gameplay here, I only added sound effects, and look how big the difference is. Our next hack is to just add some minor variations into your game to vary it up. The example game still feels a bit repetitive, and so we're just going to add some variations in what the player will see in order to give them a bit more of a varied experience. It's a classic technique used by the largest AAA games to the smallest indie games. And while some games definitely use it far too much with just reskinning the same monster over and over again, it's definitely a technique we can find a happy medium with and use it to our advantage where appropriate. To apply this in our example quickly, I made a new, smaller enemy that only takes 1 hit. I also made the orange enemy's size scale with its remaining hit points. I think this makes them quite distinct in the player's mind, and just this simple alteration helps to vary up what you're seeing on the screen. It keeps the experience fresher and for much longer. I also decided that the unchanging background was really boring, so I made it slowly morph randomly through a set of colours. Again, this helps to prevent the visuals on screen getting too scale and dull for the player. Our 8th hack to just juice up our games is to remove the parts of the games that are just boring and get in the way of the fun. So this is something I noticed in our example game, and it's something I see in game jam games all of the time, where I just find myself asking, why is the dev making me do this? A classic example is when your weapon is single shot, and so you have to click the mouse every time you want to shoot, even though there's no good reason why it couldn't just be a click and hold automatic weapon. And while there's nothing objectively wrong with this example single shot weapon, if there's no really good gameplay reason for having it as a single shot weapon, why not just make it automatic? I made the gun automatic, and now it's so much more fun to use. It makes you feel more powerful when playing the game. This change did come at a little cost though. It was now much easier as you no longer had to worry as much about just rapidly clicking your mouse. You just fire at your fire rate with no problem. An easy fix I could make to this game that would help remedy this is to just add more enemies. Defeating enemies is satisfying anyway and pretty easy to do, so just adding more of them was a simple idea that again eliminated the slow pacing that got in the way of the game's fun elements. And you need to think about it really carefully. Are there parts of your game that needlessly restrict the player's fun? Does having lives in your game actually matter, or is it just annoyingly preventing the player from progressing further with loads of game over screens? Does ammo in your game actually make it more tactical, or is it just a boring waste of time to go and collect more each time you run out? Asking yourself questions like this will help you strip back the design of your game to its core elements and the things that will hopefully make it the most fun. Our next and final point is to iterate and iterate on your ideas. Each of the tips so far have been pretty specific, but I'm going to be much broader with this next one. Once your game has reached a playable state where all the mechanics are implemented, you want to take the ideas and tricks that you've added and iterate on them just a few times, not too much. You don't want to get stuck, but you want to iterate on them a few times to make sure you can spot any improvements that can be made on them. For example, did you add too many particles, or are there not quite enough? Are there more visuals you need to add to the screen, or is the UI completely overly cluttered now? Working out ways you can make these iterative improvements over time will make you more effective at adding these tricks into your game and make you a better game developer as a whole. Just as an example, we're going to make a couple more changes to our example game we have here. I felt the purpose of the game was still a little hard to decipher, as the score isn't always the most obvious. So I added little score pop-ups after defeating an enemy to really hammer home the idea that you're trying to get as high a score as possible, and I think it looks really nice. Also, I now thought it was a little too easy for the player to hold down the mouse button without thinking and letting the cannon fire forever, making me wonder why the player would ever stop shooting. To balance this for the player, I added a little overheating mechanic on the cannon. This means that the player has to think about when they are firing, instead of just aimlessly shooting it forever. If they overheat at the wrong time, they might be defenseless and caught out by the enemies. But it's still an easy to use weapon that feels powerful for the player to use, they just have to consider when they should be using it. And with that, we have taken this pretty boring and flat game and turned it into this juicy, pretty impactful arcade experience. Even though the core mechanic of the game is basically identical. Hopefully we can start to see how some of these ideas would translate onto full, bigger projects, because I know that I'm definitely planning on using some of these tricks in some of my future games. So I really hope this gives you some ideas and tools to really sharpen up your indie games and make them more impactful. And as always, subscribe and like if you enjoyed this video or found it useful. I make a video every Tuesday and every Friday, so there's plenty of content to go around. And until next time, goodbye.